Hello, and welcome to Mr. K is Wrong, where I look at the Facebook memes posted by somebody I call Mr. K, and I debunk his right wing bullcrap. Now, I knew Mr. K back in my younger days, and I always knew he was a little bit right wing, but he wasn't as extreme to my knowledge back then as he is now, as somebody who is more of a MAGA Kool Aid drinker. And I'm going to look at one of his relatively modest memes. It's a little bit like an old school meme that Republicans would have posted back in the day. It's not quite as goofballish and bizarre. So it is a right wing meme, though, of course. And I'm going to debunk it by noting all the ways in which MAGA and even Reaganism complicate the narrative that the meme puts forth. So, the meme says the goal of communism was never to tax the rich. It was to eliminate the middle class. In communism, there are only two classes, the ruling class and the peasants. So I do apologize. I've got a bit of a cold that came roaring back up, apparently. So hopefully you can understand what I'm saying. But anyway, let's look at this meme, which says that communism has only two classes, the ruling class and the peasants. So the meme is built around a grain of truth wrapped in a very misleading simplification. Yes, many authoritarian communist states did end up with a privileged ruling elite and a politically constrained public. That seems undeniable at this point. And the Soviet system is a real example that critics point to, and by all means, go ahead. The party insiders often had access to better housing, schools, stores, and influence than ordinary citizens. And that's just one of many, many reasons you could criticize the old Soviet Union. But the meme, it struggles for several reasons. It tries to put several very different ideas into one propaganda slogan. You've got communism destroys the middle class, taxing the rich leads to communism, only anti left politics protect ordinary people. That is the assumption, or those are the assumptions that this meme is trying to put forward. So, historically and economically, these claims actually do not hold up very well. And here's what I mean. The meme falsely equates taxing the rich with authoritarian communism. This is probably the biggest flaw in the meme itself. So, to be clear, countries with high taxes on the wealthy are often actually capitalist democracies with strong middle classes, not exactly communist dictatorships. So, examples of that include Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland. And of course, you could probably add some others to the list, but those are four of the most prominent ones. So, in those countries, they actually protect private property. They allow markets and corporations. They even have wealthy citizens and maintain broad middle class prosperity through progressive taxation and social programs. Now, I'm not saying those countries are perfect. I'm not saying that they have, no constraints on, the upper class at all, but they're not communistic. They don't do away totally with class distinction. And I do have to wonder, would that be so bad if they actually did try in some ways to get rid of social stratification? I don't think so. I don't think that would necessarily be that bad of a premise, but I'm going to put that aside for now. So, the statement that the goal of communism was never to tax the rich is partly a bait and switch. Modern progressive taxation exists across many capitalist democracies that are nowhere near communist. Now, you might say that capitalism and democracy don't go hand in hand, they're contradictory, and all that kind of stuff. And, there's a debate to be had there, but I'm largely going to put that aside because in reality, we do have mixed systems. So there's no society that is completely devoid of class. So the meme accidentally describes many oligarchic systems, including parts of modern right wing politics. The irony is that a ruling class and peasants is often closer to critiques of oligarchy, plutocracy, or authoritarian capitalism than it is to everyday center left taxation policy. So keep in mind, critics of modern MAGA politics, such as myself, argue that several policies have strengthened elite wealth and weakened the middle class. That includes large tax cuts skewed toward high earners and deregulation benefiting major corporations, attacks on labor unions, reductions in social spending, tariffs that raise consumer prices. Obviously, that's a huge part of the Trump agenda, and policies favoring inherited wealth. So, independent analyses of Trump era tax cuts found benefits across, you know, various income groups, but disproportionately, like vastly disproportionately, large gains for wealthy households and corporations. So that complicates the meme's implied story that the right protects the middle class while the left destroys it. Reality is actually quite different from that. And Reaganism itself contributed to middle class stagnation. This is another complication. The meme assumes that lower taxes plus anti communism equals a stronger middle class, but under Ronald Reagan and the broader neoliberal turn, unions weakened, wealth concentration increased, and I don't mean, the concentration of wealth among the general population, I mean among the 100 millionaires and the billionaires. And corporate power expanded, housing and education costs rose faster than wages, and middle class wage growth slowed over time. And many economists argue that since the 1980s, the US economy has increasingly funneled gains far more upward, even while productivity rose. That does not mean Reagan caused communism, of course. It means the meme's simple morality play breaks down because anti communist politics did not automatically preserve middle class power. And market capitalism can also produce extreme inequality and elite dominance. Those things that this meme actually accuses communism of doing so uniquely well. Well, that's something that is a feature of the American capitalist system, of course. And communist countries did not literally eliminate the middle class. The meme overstates this too. In many communist states, professionals, engineers, doctors, managers, scientists, and skilled urban workers, they still existed as recognizable social strata. And even scholarship on early communist Eastern Europe shows that parts of the middle class adapted and sometimes succeeded within the system despite political repression. So, the only rulers and peasants part of that meme is rhetorically dramatic, but not sociological. It's not sociologically accurate. So, the meme ignores that authoritarianism is the real issue. The strongest critique of Soviet style communism is not that they taxed rich people. That's what a lot of these rich ass bitches would want you to believe. But it's more simply that they had one party rule, suppression of dissent, censorship, secret police, lack of democratic accountability, and concentration of state power. And hey, why does that sound kind of familiar to the MAGA era? Hmm. I wonder why all those things sound relevant to that. Well, All of those are political problems, not simply tax policy. Right now, the critics, the political scientists, legal scholars, and anyone with eyes, ears, and a brain have raised alarms regarding Donald Trump's governance style, recognizing many of his actions and proposals as a distinct authoritarian playbook that threatens democratic backsliding, to say the least. That's putting it mildly. You could also say, you know, uh, we're going down with the ship. And the primary actions and structural strategies implemented or at least proposed by Trump that critics point to as evidence of those tendencies, well, it includes the concentration of state power and the so called unitary executive theory. The unitary executive drive is one of the main things that Donald Trump has been talking about. It's not just his drive out on the golf course, it's part of what is driving his agenda. He wants what he's calling the unitary executive power. So Trump's second administration has heavily relied on an extreme interpretation of, the powers of the executive. And this legal framework asserts that the president has absolute, unchecked authority over all 4 million employees and every department within the executive branch. So it's subjugating independent agencies through directives like the Ensuring Accountability for All Agencies Executive Order. Trump has aggressively sought to eliminate the historic independence of bipartisan regulatory bodies. He has moved to dismiss heads of the Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC, the National Labor Relations Board, or the NLRB, and the Federal Reserve Board, arguing they must fear and obey the chief executive. And then there's the so called Schedule F and the purging of the civil service. A cornerstone of Trump's strategy is the reimplementation of Schedule F. This reclassifies up to 50,000 merit based career civil servants into political appointees, stripping them of protections so they can be fired at will and replaced with loyalists. So, that sounds like an authoritarian system because that's exactly what it is. There is a lack of democratic accountability. He's been sidelining Congress as much as possible. Trump frequently bypasses the legislative branch by issuing unilateral executive actions or declaring national emergencies to redirect funds and enact sweeping policy changes, fundamentally eroding the separation of powers. There's been dismissal of inspectors general. To weaken institutional oversight, Trump has targeted independent internal watchdogs, firing numerous independent inspectors general across multiple departments without legally required justification, effectively stymieing internal accountability. He's been defying judicial review. Legal scholars have expressed severe concern over actions and executive orders that explicitly seek to consolidate the authority to interpret federal laws solely within the White House and the Attorney General, bypassing traditional judicial review. All authoritarian. There's been the suppression of dissent and censorship, the targeting of the free press. Look what he tried to do with Jimmy Kimmel, for example. Trump has consistently sought to intimidate major news outlets, threatened to strip broadcasting licenses, and he's suggested jailing journalists who refuse to reveal government sources, and he's called them treasonous just for asking certain questions. So, this rhetoric that he's often used fosters an atmosphere of self censorship among media and civic organizations, and he has also tried to do actual censorship. And keep in mind, this is also somebody who tried to ban all Muslims from entering the United States, which is weird because, as I note, and how so few people also note, the United States, and especially Donald Trump, has a close relationship with Saudi Arabia. So it's very strange that somebody who wants to ban all Muslims from entering the country is so closely allied with a Muslim dictatorship, an Islamic theocratic state. And you might want to ask somebody over in Saudi Arabia why they're allied with him. It sounds like an anti Muslim type of relationship. So, there are all sorts of these weird contradictions in the Trump universe. And then he's been weaponizing public narratives. He's been having a constant narrative of crime, violence, and radical left threats to frame public protests as insurrections, thereby trying to justify extreme crackdowns and constructing pretexts to marginalize civil opposition. And he's been retaliating against private speech as well. His administration has used regulatory and corporate threats against companies or individuals who voice dissent, such as publicly demanding the firing of late night hosts, like I mentioned earlier, or weaponizing tax audits against political adversaries. And keep in mind, he's gone after the Southern Poverty Law Center, claiming that they're an extremist organization just because the SPLC sometimes funds informants who reveal the inner workings of extremist right wing organizations. And he is perversely using that fact to go after them like they are the extremist group, even though the SPLC has actually been battling far right extremist activity. And really, the rat to be smelled there is that if Trump wanted to go after extremist right wing organizations, well, for one thing, he'd have to go after MAGA right away, but he could also target specific neo Nazi organizations or, of course, chapters of the Ku Klux Klan or the KKK. He could go after them, but instead he's going after the one of the organizations that specifically targets these groups. And again, the claim is that because they are sometimes relying on informants who receive money, that somehow they are directly funding the extremist organizations. Well, I'll let you figure out how much sense that makes. But there's been the secret police and the use of force. He's been deploying federal forces domestically and frequently deploying federal law enforcement and National Guard units in the cities, often over the objection of local leaders. It's a dangerous politicization of state force. And, of course, ICE has been everywhere. And, he even once said that, well, probably more than once, but he said that ICE is there to investigate fraud. Well, ICE is not there that's not what they're specifically designated to do. They are to enforce immigration policy, not to investigate fraud. That's what the legal system does, not ICE. But the fascists, they do not care about such distinctions between departments because they are lawless. They want ICE to be able to do anything and everything, whatever Trump wants them to do, or Stephen Miller or whichever cretin is at the top, really. So he's also made threats of the Insurrection Act. Remember Trump's repeated threats to invoke the Insurrection Act to police domestic protests, alongside discussions by top allies regarding the suspension of habeas corpus under the guise of national security. The civil rights groups have seen these as indicating a desire to enforce martial control or martial law. And this is going to be more relevant as the midterms approach later this year, because he will try to interfere with those votes, because it looks like there could genuinely be what is popularly called a blue wave, and that would significantly, well, I should say potentially significantly challenge Trump's power. So, there also are tendencies toward one party rule. He's been manipulating electoral systems. Trump has routinely pressured Republican lawmakers to aggressively gerrymander voting districts to structurally guarantee legislative majorities, regardless of popular vote shifts. And keep in mind, in response to that, Democrats have been deciding, well, you know what? If the Republicans can gerrymander in such an aggressive fashion, well, we should be able to as well. And, if the Republicans are basically going to cheat, by shifting these votes around, um, it's it's only fair that the other party is able to do the same thing. He's been weaponizing the Department of Justice rather than treating law enforcement as an independent arbiter. Trump's directives have sought to place the Department of Justice under direct political command to investigate, prosecute, and neutralize political opponents. And there's, of course, been a cult of personality and partisanship. You know, Trump has successfully reshaped the Republican Party entirely around personal loyalty to himself by casting political rivals not just as opponents, but as totally illegitimate, blood destroying enemies of the state. And his rhetoric lays the conceptual groundwork for a system where political pluralism is entirely rejected. So, importantly, concentrated power can emerge under communist dictatorships, of course, but also fascist regimes, military juntas, monarchies, or, yes, oligarchic capitalist systems. So history shows many paths toward ruling class versus everyone else. And MAGA rhetoric itself often paradoxically uses anti elite language while actually and actively empowering elites. This is another contradiction that is worth noting here. MAGA politics frequently frames itself as anti establishment, pro worker, anti globalist, and anti elite, but many actual policy outcomes favor corporations, billionaires, high finance, and asset holders. The big movers and shakers of the economy, what some people now call the Epstein class. And even conservative populism today contains tension between cultural populism, like the attitude that you got to fight the elites, and the economic policies that often benefit wealthy interests. That doesn't make all MAGA voters hypocrites necessarily, although I think it kind of does, maybe. Uh, yeah, it kind of does that. I'm sorry. Um, let's correct that record.